Now, I'd like to welcome you formally. My name's Gibbons and I am the Director of Studies for Theology and Religion here, which is taught in various ways. And this morning I thought for an open day I'd give you an insight into a field of work that I'm involved in on about 4 different levels. One of which is I study and research Eastern Christianity. Second level is I'm part of an institute in London University, one of their fellows for the Centre for Eastern Christianity, so that's a very focused work. I'm also part of the Centre for Christianity and Culture at Regent's Park, which is my college, and there I'm involved in a new programme on religious diversity and freedom, and part of it will be my own interest in Middle Eastern Christianity, which is becoming more and more apparent in the news as things keep on happening over in Iraq, Iran and elsewhere. But I thought I'd introduce this as one of the things we do in theology here, which is such a varied group of subject areas. I just thought Middle Eastern Christianity and Eastern Christianity is something some people know a bit about, a lot of people know very little about, and a few people know quite a lot about. So I'm hoping that you fall into some of those categories, and I can share with you my own insights. The slides don't totally connect up with the prompt sheet, but the prompt sheet is really a guide to the churches. It's so complex explaining these different churches of the Middle East that I thought that particular sheet would help. So perhaps I can begin there. Is that all right with everybody? Right. Eastern Christianity is something that is very complex to understand because a lot of history over the past 2,000 years is concentrated mainly for us in a Western setting. When you talk about religious traditions, we talk about Judaism and Christianity and Islam as the great monolithic religions of Abraham. But Eastern Christianity as part of Christianity has often only been known to us through the Slav countries. I mean, a lot of people know all about Russia and Russian Orthodoxy, and then if you've been on holiday to Greece, you might know something about Greek Orthodoxy. But the other Christians, many of whom come from a very early strata of time, were often submerged in things like the Ottoman Empire and had very little contact with the West, and in fact very little contact with each other. And it's only in the past 100 years that a lot of connections have been made. So I'm going to go on a little journey exploring this for you. But this little map here simplifies a totally complex structure. If you think of early Christianity as being not monolithic, but communities of different towns and places that eventually become united under the leaders that they have, the bishops so-called, and connect in faith rather than in common practice. That's the way Christianity develops, and basically you're developing along 2 lines, which I'll show you in a moment, all coterminous with the Roman Empire, the Latin West and the Greek East. And then there's this other group of linguistics people who follow not Greek tradition, but are actually Syriac, Coptic, following much more an Aramaic Hebrew tradition of language, Semitic languages. And these people tend to disappear slightly. So we have early Christianity, and then what we have on the branch, various councils occur in early Christianity, which are all about sorting the mess and sorting the doctrine and sorting jurisdiction out. There's a lot of nigglers going on, if you like. Once the empire becomes settled and Christianity becomes a religion that the state accepts and not a persecuted religion, and that's mainly by Constantine when he wins his victory at the Milvian Bridge and then says Christianity is a religion he will accept in the empire. From 315 onwards, Christianity becomes part of imperial religion, and in 325 Constantine forces the Christian community to come and define certain aspects of their faith, and it's at that point that fragmentation happens. So we have the beginnings of breakup of separate lineage. And we find that what starts to happen is groups. The Assyrian church fragments because it doesn't understand the language. The language of debate is Greek and Latin, and they're a Semitic culture, so terminology is difficult. And so they say, we can't understand what's going on, we won't accept this, and they go their own way. So the first fragmentation occurs very early on in the 4th century. And then there's another split because they're trying to define the nature of Jesus. Who is he? Is he God? Is he man? Is he a prophet? What do the Christian community say about him? And of course, they're using philosophical and theological language. Okay if you understand it, and okay if you understand the background, which is Greek mainly. But if you're someone from a culture that's actually allied to what we would now call Asia, different type of intellectual culture, there are problems in the definitions. And so another group splinters off, the Oriental Orthodox churches, and they go their separate way. So we have that movement. And then we have the churches linking together quite happily, in some cases, until territorial disputes start emerging. And of course, from the 8th century onwards, the rise of Islam means that Christianity in the Middle East is going to be much more focused on survival, because vast swathes, as I'll show you on a map, of Christianity disappear under Islam. And so the survival of these two groups is going to be very interesting. It's a long, long, complicated history, which is only just emerging, to our knowledge, if you like, in what's happening in Iraq, Iran, and in the Palestinian conflict, because there's a lot of this background still emerging. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't really emerge until the Reformation, but the Catholic Church, with a big C, holds together with the orthodoxy, meaning right belief, until the schism. There's a huge schism in the 11th century, which is mainly to do with power, although it's claimed to be doctrine. And so you find that East and West break relationships off. The great bishops of the East, including the great Bishop of Constantinople, severs ties with the Pope of Rome, and Catholicism becomes the tradition mainly of the West, and Orthodoxy mainly of what we call Mediterranean East in terms of Aegean, and if you like, becomes also part of the Slav tradition. And this exists, this sort of existence carries on right up to today. And then from the Catholic Church, of course, we get the Protestant Reformation, which we're going to be celebrating more of in 2017. But suddenly, at various points, you will find that the Eastern churches, some of the Eastern churches, want to reunite, if you like, back. And so you find that there are groups of churches that decide to reconnect with the Pope of Rome as they were in this period here. Now, that's a very brief and a rather sorry attempt on my part to try and show you. But if we try and think of it like this, Christianity, mainly for our historical purposes, in the West, right up to the Reformation, is what we'd call Catholic. But here, and a little bit here, it was Orthodox, Greeks, and it divided along the lines of the empire itself, Greek-speaking East, Latin-speaking West. Here are the Syriac churches and the Oriental churches, and of course all this area became submerged under the Islamic expansion, and they disappeared. Although, we're going to hear, as I'll tell you, there was an uneasy truce with Islam, and sometimes a good truce with Islam, at various points in the narrative and the history, until we come till, if you like, today. The key places that we need to remind ourselves are, in the West, Rome is the capital of the old empire. In the East, there's going to be a new Rome developed, mainly by Justinian, and he's going to take the town of Byzantium, which is now modern Istanbul, and rename it Constantinople, and that becomes the centre of Greek-speaking empire, and is known not only as Byzantium, but as the city of God, in one particular phrase. Then we have, near Damascus today, the ancient city of Antioch, a very important city in ancient antiquity for learning, particularly learning, as well as a port where many, many different races and nations came together. Jerusalem, which has a sorry history, but is the birthplace of Christianity, and therefore has a kind of mother memory for the community. And then in Egypt here, the great city of Alexandria, which of course is a great port, but also a great intellectual centre. So we have very strong intellectual centres that have come from antiquity, the Christian community settled in. And in particular, these two, Alexandria and Damascus, there was far more connectiveness between the different traditions of religious observance than you might like to think. For a while, there was tolerance between Jews and Christians, and then there was a persecution of the Christians by the Jewish community, and then it reversed itself later on. When Islam emerged, there was quite a tolerant connection with Eastern Christianity and the origins of Islam. In fact, one of the churches I represent, as I look after an Eastern Catholic church, translated many texts for the early Islamic community, which of course were in the first stages Bedouin, and didn't have the scholars. And so it was the Christian community which actually transcribed texts from other languages into Arabic and then handed it to the community of the faithful. So there was, if you like, in early Islam, quite a strong Christian influence. In fact, it's believed that the Prophet himself had connections with Nestorian Christianity, and possibly some of his family were either clergy or were faithful people. And so there is an indication too, which people never really know about, that when the Prophet was making peace with various cities, the letters he wrote were very interesting in the sense that he expressly forbade proselytization of Jew and Christian by the Islamic community, which is often not heard of, but he, in his own treatise, forbade this, and he said, if a Christian marries a Muslim, then they retain their faith, and if the Christian happens to be the male, the father, then the children must follow the faith of the father. This, of course, disappears later on in kind of conquest, but the early tradition had much more connection than we think. What else have we got? Sorry, I don't want to... At the heart of it all, of course, Christianity focuses on the person of Jesus. And this is something where Eastern Christianity has a particular viewpoint. Very early on, it was a community of communities that had to exist in a state of persecution. And so they had a very strong definition of faith, which enabled them to carry on their life. And of course, they were known by a very unpleasant terminology, which IS are busily scribbling all over places in the lands that they're conquering. The Nazarenes, in other words, those who follow Jesus of Nazareth. And the N, the Arabic N, is something they're daubing on walls. That was the pejorative term for this community. The Nazarenes who followed the man from Nazareth, or the prophet from Nazareth, who the Christian community, because of the belief in his resurrection and his teaching, said was the Son of God. And then, in definitions, made the strong claim that he is, for them, both human and divine, if you like, the divine and human nature in one person. I won't go into the sort of philosophical, theological structure of that, but it was a debate that came very strongly, and the East accepted it very easily. Well, the West went through various periods, sometimes saying Jesus was just simply a God who came down in human form, and occasionally saying, well, he was semi-divine, which was an Arian position, which was the position of Gaul and what we call modern-day Spain for quite a long time, until they were told to pull their socks up and learn better. Anyway, but this is an image of Christ. The Christian community in its art very carefully refrained from trying to break the great prohibition about imaging God. But in the East there was a huge debate about art, and it came about in the way that they said, because he lived a human life, and because the Gospels are the story of him in his life with his people, we can image those, we can paint them, we can use them as visual books. And so the art of Christianity develops in a particular way. So in the East it becomes very much art as book, linked to scripture and theology. And the art of the icon, the true image, is one that emerges and remains very strong within the traditions of Eastern Christianity, whereas in the West it developed in a much more vibrant way, in a different way, and you find that very quickly three-dimensional art is used, carving, statuary, and then of course individuality emerges, especially with the Reformation, where the artists themselves develop through the Renaissance their own particular techniques and their own styles. In the East it's all submerged, it's connected to teaching, to doctrine, to faith, and therefore you're not going to move outside certain parameters. So the iconography of the East is very interesting. Most of you will be familiar with this type of icon, the icon of the Orthodox, but the Copts and the Syriac tradition have their own form of iconography, which is a particular style and in itself very vibrant. But there is a kind of link, because the image of Christ has never really varied. And this comes from a tradition in the East, whether it's true or not we don't know, of a common agreement that he looked somehow like this. Where it comes from we don't know. Possibly a tradition that may be very apocryphal of Christ himself being asked for a portrait by the king of Persia, Abgar, in the period that he was alive. And the tradition is that he didn't give a picture, he instead took a cloth and put it on his face, and the sweat and the mess formed a portrait, and that was taken away and became the tradition of the Mandylion, the image not made by hands, which is like this, which then reappears in history. So this is the Christ that emerges, and it's very easily understood. This is a 6th century image, pre-iconoclasm, still in St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, and this is the type of prototype that becomes the sort of great visual image of the Eastern faith. So that's Christ, who is, as I once said, an educated Christ, because we don't know whether he actually could write. He certainly could read, and he certainly was very literate, but whether he wrote, we don't know. But here he is with the book of the Gospels, and he's here as not only the Christ who people follow, but as the Christ who is going to come at the end of time to judge the living and the dead, and is the emperor of all life, hence his purple clothes. He becomes, in a sense, the ultimate ruler of all, the cosmic Christ who is in charge of everybody. And that means that the emperor as well has to bow down before him. So is that all right so far for you? Okay. You do.
Are there questions at the end?
Yes, you can have questions at the end. If you asked a quick one, I can help you. I'll try now.
I just wanted to say about the face of Christ, which is that that is a common face.
It is a common face, and there's a convention, isn't there? Because beards are wisdom and maturity. But it's the key here is going to be the eyes. The iconography of the East is talking about the image as a way to connect to the reality it represents. And how does it do? It's the eyes that connect. So the eyes look at you. It's not meant to be a kind of portrait where you wander around, the eyes follow you to make you feel bad. It's an icon is something to do with prayer, and it has its setting within the doctrinal and prayer life of a community, which I will come to in a moment. I'll talk a little bit more about the different churches. I thought I'd throw in a picture of the Armenian Orthodox. The way the Christian communities organise themselves are, and I must say, complex. That's why you've got this sheet. But we have to remind ourselves that certain cultures and certain natures began with this religious tradition. So, for instance, Armenia, which is a very neglected culture and community at the moment, really formed itself through Christian missionaries from the Syriac East. So you find that these communities of Oriental, that is non-Greek speaking, Coptic or Aramaic speaking Christians, went as missionaries to Sicilia and places like that, and they formed communities which eventually formed the Armenian nation. And these particular missionaries formed the alphabet, so they devised the alphabet, much the same as the Cyrillic script for the Slav countries was actually formed by Cyril, Methodius and others as missionary endeavour to translate texts into local language. Now the Armenians are a very proud people with their own particular tradition of worship, and they form part of what we'd call, as you can see on your sheet, the Oriental families. If you think of Christianity as families, there are 5 blocks of family. The Oriental Orthodox, which we are now beginning to hear more about because of what's going on in Iraq and Iran. And they are communities with a very ancient pedigree. Some of them are older than the Church of Rome, and many of them have existed as small communities in intense persecution all their lives. They have therefore got very interesting traditions which are fascinating to those who don't understand that change occurs within the context of community. And the Armenian community is a particular community which connected itself both in terms of ethnography. It was to do with its language and its culture were Christian. So when you find the problems, as happened under Turkey, with the depopulation of people and removal of people, the whole business of religion came into the issue very, very strongly. There is at the moment a kind of love of the Ottoman Empire going on, and I get quite cross about it because everybody says it was a wonderful, wonderful sort of empire, and everybody lived in harmony, although human rights were at the behest of the great Sultan. On the other hand, religions were tolerated to an extent. The system was known as the millet system, or millet system, and the communities who weren't of the faithful Islam were dhimmi, or dhimmi as you'd say. They were second-class groups who paid lots of taxes, including their children. Their children were taken from them to form part of the Janissary army, or the girls were taken and went off to various either harem or to be as wives to particular people. So there was a lot of this kind of trafficking in human lives going on, as well as enormous punishments and infringements, including differences of dress. The communities of Israel and the communities of the Christians were not allowed to wear green, for instance, because that was the prophet's colour. And silly things like that. And the dress I sometimes wear on Sundays, which has a stovepipe hat, that was a deliberate insult from the Ottoman Turks, trying to make the priests look as though they were wearing chimneys on their head with a little sort of conical smoke deflector. And that was why the Greek clergy wear their hats with that funny little top, as a deliberate attempt to humiliate them. It's now become a source of pride, so it backfired spectacularly, but it doesn't matter. And then you find also within the East, you've got the Oriental churches. Orthodoxy is the second great family, centering mainly around the city of New Rome, that is the city of Istanbul, where the great church of Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, actually became the great source, if you like, of life for the Orthodox. And Hagia Sophia at the moment is in a very precarious position. I'm sure some of you might know about it, that under Erdogan's particular flavour, there's a debate raging about whether it should be turned back into a mosque.
It is a mosque.
No, it's a museum. It's a museum. It's been a museum for a while, since Ataturk. It's not a mosque. And in fact, the problem is that if they turn it into a mosque, the Christian communities themselves are saying, right, it was the great church for as long as it's been a mosque, in fact longer. therefore we're going to start demanding as well. So there's all sorts of precarious business going on in Turkey. Turkey, remember, was very orthodox. It was an orthodox community until Islam, and then the Ottoman invasion. It was rather late on that the fall of Constantinople happened. But the great church was the biggest building in the world at one point. That was a religious building in the world, and formed, if you like, part of this great complex of a city that was intensely religious. And the patriarch, the senior bishop there, known as the ecumenical patriarch, the one who has jurisdiction across the world, became the senior bishop of orthodoxy, first after the Bishop of Rome. There's a kind of hierarchy of senior figures in the ancient world. The Bishop of Rome was the primus inter pares, the first of the equals, because he was the bishop of Old Rome, the empire. And as the empire began to collapse in the West, so the power of the Pope began to rise. And so in Western medieval history, you'll see the papacy as a unifying or destructive force, but a force nevertheless that replaces, and very craftily under Charlemagne, the old emperor. And in fact, the Pope still has terminology from the imperial armory. He's the Pontifex Maximus, the big bridge builder. And you get all these, sort of even the organisation of the church in the older structures, deaneries and parishes and dioceses, are purely Roman structures that were taken over and used. And the bishops themselves were made senior officials and were given the right to wear imperial purple because they were trustworthy. So they began as overseers who looked after the local population as well as their own population, because they were trustworthy people. So that's how, in fact, after Constantine, Christianity took on the institution of Rome. But here, by the Bosphorus, this great church formed the worship and the setting of Orthodox Christianity. So the second family of Christianity, the Orthodox, which now comprises of numbers of different churches, I'll put them up in a minute, are mainly connected to the bishop of this place, who now resides in dire straits on a little island called Halki, where he still remains the ecumenical patriarch, but without many faithful people. And there's a real problem, because the Turkish government will not allow the election of the patriarch from anybody except a Turkish citizen. And until recently, we're not allowing Greeks to take on citizenship so they could have enough people among the clergy to elect a bishop from. So there's a whole problem going on there. This is the interior, where you've still got the Islamic images, but you also have the Christian frescoes are being cleaned. The danger is if it's turned into a mosque, then one can see what might happen. They've already started that in one of the monasteries further up in Turkey, where they put hangings in front of the old mosaics so that they don't disturb the faithful. And then you think, well, maybe the next stage is whitewashing, but we'll see. Let's look at that. Here he is. This is the present Patriarch Bartholomew. Very interesting character. He was educated in many universities, particularly he spent time in Rome too, where he learned Italian and is very friendly with the Catholic community. And here is his opposite number, the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill. Russia, I'm not going to talk too much about, but Russia is the biggest and largest of the Orthodox churches in the world, and is increasing in number ever since the identification of Russian people with Orthodoxy has returned. I mean, you'll see Vladimir Putin is very careful to make sure that on big occasions he's seen lighting a candle on great feasts in the church with the Patriarch somewhere nearby, just to keep that identification of Holy Russia going. So Orthodoxy and Russia go together. It's causing troubles in the Ukraine, which was where, of course, Russian Orthodoxy was first imported from Constantinople, from the Greeks, because the Ukrainian churches have split, and some of them don't want anything to do with Moscow or Russia. So there's a little tussle. But the Russian Patriarch calls himself the Third Rome, the Patriarch of the Third Rome at the moment. So in the realpolitik of Christianity, these two figures and the Pope of Rome are quite key players. It's quite interesting to see what's going on.
Just ask a question.
Do.
Does Moscow accept his subservient position to
Reluctantly. Historically you have to. Doctrinally you have to. You can't unturn, because the whole sort of idea that you owe a legitimate position to being a church founded from Constantinople as part of the tradition can't then suddenly say, well, we're senior to Constantinople. But what you do say is, well, we've got more people than you, and we've got more churches, therefore we should be seen as a very important place. That's why Third Rome is the key. But there's always a tussle going on here between the jurisdiction of the ecumenical patriarch and this particular man. Interestingly, Bartholomew is known as the Green Patriarch. He's really very much into the problems with environmental issues, and is somebody who's gathering people together to really tackle problems. He took a whole load of people on a boat, including a lot of church leaders who poo-pooed this, just to show them destruction of the glaciers in the Norwegian fjords and things like that. And he showed them exactly what was going on at the sort of the end of the cycle, if you have a glacier, seeing it just be destroyed so quickly, and they began to realise that actually he was quite serious. He's done a lot of writing. He's a very, very nice man. I've met him. And he's actually a very unifying force in his own community. Jerusalem, the Jerusalem community is the other Orthodox community, but this is really a problem place. Any of you who've been there will know. This is where Christianity shows its true colours and fights all the time. And in a sense, that's really perhaps how it's always been. But there have been big strides made. This was the last pope at a meeting in Jerusalem. This is the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But here he is with the last pope, the Pope Emeritus. But there are also some of these other Oriental churches and Catholic churches, and one also has to remember the Protestant churches of the Middle East coming together because the situation of communities of faith there is dire. It's a dire situation, and I'll come to that later on. So Jerusalem, although it's not important in numbers, is important in terms of history and faith. And one of the dangers is that the indigenous Christian communities, who are mainly Arab, are being driven out because of Israeli-Hamas conflict, and now what's going on with IS. And many of them have fled. I look after a community of Greek Catholics who are all Arab, and many of them come from the region of the Galilee. But in the past 10 years, it's hemorrhaged terribly from, I can't remember the statistics, there's huge losses going on. Say it was 20,000, it'll be down to something like 3. And many of them are not going back. This is one of the issues that's going on at the moment. They're going back to places of immigration, and they're settling with families and relatives who have already been abroad. So the structure of the Eastern Christian communities in the Middle East is shifting all the time, and it needs to be watched and it needs to be monitored. That's just, if anyone wants this, you can ask me and I can email it to you if you like. These are just the different churches. There are 27 churches connected to Constantinople. Different traditions, but united in a kind of faith and common order. And you can see, here's Russia with its satellite churches, Church of Cyprus, which is badly splintered now because of the north-south divide. Jerusalem, Antioch, the Church of Antioch, which is Arab. And then there are some Slav countries, Poland, which you don't assume has Orthodox in it, but it does. The resurgence of Christianity in places of communist, Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, all those countries are reviving their sort of practice, Georgia. And then you find that with these churches there's often a counterpart, just to complicate matters. So you've got the Orthodox, Oriental, then you have the Catholic Eastern churches. Most people think Catholics are Roman Catholics and that's it. But they're not. There are 23 churches in communion with the Roman Catholics who are Catholic. That is, they accept the Pope as their main head, but they keep the customs of the Christian family they belonged to, and they are very strong in the Middle East. In fact, in Galilee region, it's the Greek Catholic Church, which is the strongest church of all. And if you go to the Lebanon, you'll find there a church called the Maronite Church, which never splintered from Rome, ever, and has always remained an Oriental Catholic church through the tradition. And then further afield, you find that churches under persecution have asked to be reunited with the Roman Church because it's such a huge Christian group. It provides a kind of safety for them. So we find that the Chaldean church in Iraq, which is now extinct in the city of Mosul, the last Christians have gone within the past 2 months, there's nobody left. They are surviving mainly because they split into two, and one group became Catholic and therefore had a strong protection via the Vatican through the United Nations. So there's that going on there. When you actually talk about Christianity, you talk about destruction, an empty tomb, crucifixion, and in fact these Christians of the East really are a witness to that. But what we also owe to them is actually the development of writing, so text. They wrote, they illuminated. Here we have the prophet Moses here dictating to a scribe, and we have God, who is not imaged as a finger, hands, blessing him, telling him to tell the scribe what to write. And then we have transmission of faith through key figures, some of whom are women, not all are men, so don't worry, there's a balance in the church. You get a great group from Cappadocia, Basil, Gregory and Macrina, 3 huge theologians who formed Eastern Christianity and actually affected the West. But people here like Clement, whose writings still are used, formed the church. And then, as I said, East and West come together. The thing about the East is that they love symbols. And so you've got to remember to read the symbols carefully. Standing next to someone is not simply a sign that you like them. It can mean all sorts of things. It can mean that we have actually bridged a gap of 1,000 years because he's standing next to him as an equal. It's little subtle things. It's very much a Middle Eastern sort of complex. But here we have the Pope, last Pope, with the Ecumenical Patriarch, and what they do now is they exchange gifts and their representatives on their respective name days, or the feast day of the particular church. So in Rome it's Peter and Paul, and in Constantinople it's Andrew, and so you find scurrying clergy and others running off to attend. Important, because it means the communication doors are open. It also means that there's subtle statements being made which percolate down to the ordinary people, saying, you know, they're not enemies, they're actually part of the same family, it's been tragic what's happened. But for them, of course, the traditions, very much like many of the Christian churches, they're built upon the rituals of passage, baptism, entry into the community through the water bath and anointing, marriages, funerals, and then, of course, the daily round of prayers. One of the things about the Eastern Church is it's never had a sacred language. It always said the language of sacredness was the language of the people that the Gospels preached to. So the Eastern Church has always adapted vernacular language. Been very good. This is actually in a church in England where this young man had come from a very sort of humanitarian background and was rejected by his family when he said he wanted to become Orthodox. So he took a step into Orthodoxy. And this is his chrismation, where he's anointed with oil as a sign of the Spirit. You can see the icons on the wall which tell you this is probably either a Russian or a Greek Orthodox church. You know, you can learn little signs there. And communion is given to children right from the word go. Because if you're thinking of how does the Christian community grow, it's its family unit, which is not just nuclear but wider family. And the child, if it's baptised, is brought to church with the family and goes up to communion. It's the parents and those who are with it who decide when it can receive. And so you'll find that the child receives communion at certain ages. Yeah.
Sorry. I hope this isn't too big a question. Why do the Catholic Church not follow that institution?
Because they split.
Include children until they are.
What they did was they split the rites up.
Ah, okay.
In the Eastern Church, you are baptised and confirmed at the same time, and then you receive communion immediately afterwards. No matter whether you're an adult or a baby, in the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, that was split historically. So confirmation became the time when you receive communion. So of course, children were older.
Catholic, I mean, you know, I made my first communion when I was 7, and the criteria was that you knew what you were old enough to know what it was all
brought
about.
up. It's the age. But it's a different way of looking at it. This is, as I'd say, faith growing up. So the unit of faith is actually the family. So families and family life are very strong for these communities here. So you bring the children up, and it's not just going to church; it's also going prayers at home, and they keep their traditions very strong. They're very strong on fasting, which I think a lot of people, I could do with a lot more fasting, but I think people forget that they understand the practice of fasting, and fasting is not simply abstaining from food. It's also, as someone explained it to me, and the Syrians talk about this, you give the animal and plant life time to rest, and you're thanking them for what they have given you. And fasting is not just during Lent. There's several seasons of the year when you fast from animal milk and certain products. And it's seen very much as a thank you, and which of course goes to many traditions. I mean, the Native Americans and people from other indigenous cultures respect animals. I mean, they might kill and eat them, but they also have this relationship with them where they honour them. And that's there hidden in the tradition. I'm just finishing a book on Eastern Christianity and environment, and into that comes this image. Right, this is the Armenian church. Again, part of the fun of this group of people are that they love dressing up, so all sorts of entertaining clothes are worn by everybody. But that's highly symbolic. It's not seen as something for the person, it's seen as something for the community because of what you're doing. So we have to remind ourselves they have a very strong sense of symbol and quite as formality. Here we have the patriarchs again. We'll ignore them, we've looked at them earlier on. This is my own boss, who is a man very involved in Syrian politics at the moment, because he actually was one of the few Christians who said earlier on that he would support Assad, and of course got blown out of the water for it. But then said the reason why I'm supporting him is if we don't have him, what will come will be far, far worse. And of course he's been proved right. And he knew it, he knew what was happening, because they had already worked out that there were, on the borders of Syria, there were these groups infiltrating from the Sunni extremist groups, and that the Shiites and the Alawites and the Izadis and the Christian groups were all going to get it. And there's been this kind of problem of ethnicity and removing groups. And this man here, I mean, he's quite entertaining, but he does have a very strong point. And he keeps saying, we are a Christian church that dialogued with Islam before it began. And we need to remind people that the word Allah, which has been forbidden to be used by Christians in Indonesia, doesn't mean the name of a particular god. It is the Arabic name for God, and therefore is used by Hebrew or Jewish Arabs, as well as Christian Arabs, as well as Muslims, and that there is a common witness to an older faith. And I think very brave, because they've had a number of people, lay and clergy, kidnapped. In fact, in Syria, as you know, there's daily kidnappings on quite a large scale, and bishops disappear and never come back. But this man really kind of is saying, we are a church to dialogue with Islam because we have been there before Islam, and we will be there with it. and that Islam itself, true Islam, is not what you see portrayed. So there is this intense respect, and because of course Arabic is the language of the church in those countries, they cannot deny that actually there are linguistic connections with the Holy Quran. The same terms are used. There's the patriarch. This is again the liturgy itself. The stress in the East is on mystery and mystical attention, and then it's very colourful, very entertaining. Here's a Coptic priest. Copts are very strong in Egypt, again, very powerful force that were pre-Arab, Pharaonic in background. Very large communities in this country. And the bishop of in this country is very influential in politics, Bishop Angelos, who has formed a council of Middle Eastern church leaders to advise the government here on the situation there. Okay, there I'm finishing, but I'm just going to finish with a terrible picture, if I can, and then we can have some questions. The problem is, wait a minute, let me get to it. That's the problem now. This is the daily situation of what's going on. So I'm doing a little bit of trying to show.
Beautiful church?
Hmm?
What did it look like, that beautiful church?
Well, it had a golden dome, but that's what it looked like when they blew it up.
1800 years old.
Yeah. But any questions? Any sort of questions? Sorry, it's been so